The turning point in Port Charles. How a lie began to unravel Dalton's empire in Port Charles. The smallest decision often becomes the spark that ignites an inferno. What began as a simple plea for help quickly spiraled into a chain of revelations that would force every major player in town to confront truths they had tried to avoid. Jason never expected to become the anchor in a youth-driven scandal, yet the moment he realized Danny had been drawn into Dalton's growing web of manipulation, everything shifted. He understood with painful clarity that the situation had surpassed anything a parent or guardian could handle alone. That was when he reached out to Alexis, because if there was one person capable of reshaping the narrative and turning fear into strategy, it was her. Alexis, seasoned by a lifetime of legal storms, reacted with a composure that veiled her mounting fury. She contacted Rick immediately, aware that justice in Port Charles often required more than one strong voice. Together, they walked into the PCPD not as spectators but as architects of a coming reckoning. Their arrival marked a silent declaration that the next moves would not be made by frightened teenagers or panicked parents, but by individuals capable of navigating the political and moral landmines embedded in the situation. Nathan, a young officer still navigating the complexities of protocol, unexpectedly became the first barrier. He insisted that the teenagers' statements were meaningless without parental presence. To him, it was a technical correction. To Jason, Dante, Lulu, and Alexis, it meant something far more critical. The truth these children were ready to tell could be lost or mishandled if they didn't take control of the situation quickly. Danny and Charlotte, previously hesitant and intimidated, were finally prepared to expose everything. The burden of carrying this secret, the fabricated testimony that had trapped Rocco in a legal nightmare, had begun to fracture their emotional stability. Yet, when Dante and Lulu first heard the idea of letting the children speak, dread overtook logic. Parents in Port Charles often suffered more from fear than the threats themselves, and the thought of placing their children in the center of a legal confrontation was almost unbearable. Jason's instinct to protect only deepened the hesitation. All three adults initially rejected the idea, believing silence could somehow shield the children from the fallout. But Port Charles has never rewarded silence. Rick took it upon himself to push the conversation into the territory everyone feared. He requested a private meeting with Dante and Lulu, stripping away emotional noise and focusing solely on the truth. What he revealed to them was colder and more devastating than anything they had imagined. Dalton's entire case against Rocco was held together by a testimony that did not stand up to legal or procedural scrutiny. The evidence was a facade, one that would crumble the moment someone had enough courage to challenge it. For Rocco to be saved, the truth could no longer remain trapped in the minds of two frightened teenagers. It had to be brought into the light. The district attorney's office would have no choice once the fabrication was exposed. Filing a false police report was not just a minor infraction, it was a criminal act, and Dalton would be forced into the very position he had created for a teenage boy. The predator would become the defendant. The manipulator would face the system he thought he controlled. And Rocco's freedom would hinge not on legal maneuvering but on moral clarity. Alexis explained this carefully when she spoke to Danny and Charlotte. She understood that they were children standing at the edge of an adult world built on power, corruption, and consequence. Her voice carried neither judgment nor pressure, only the precise, unvarnished truth. Their statements could dismantle Dalton's deceit because they were the only people who had seen how the manipulation began. They were the living proof that the story underpinning Rocco's arrest had been constructed with deliberate malice. Their testimony would not only expose Dalton, it would also force the legal system to confront the consequences of its own negligence. Jason remained silent for much of the conversation, struggling between instinct and reason. Everything in him wanted to shelter Danny from involvement in any legal storm. Yet he saw the weight his son carried, the guilt that had become a shadow clinging to him. Protecting Danny now meant something very different. It meant giving him a pathway out of the fear that had carved itself into his posture and voice. Allowing him to speak was not exposing him to harm, it was freeing him from it. Charlotte faced a similar conflict. Lulu observed her daughter with the sharp intuition only a mother can possess. There was no mistaking the torment Charlotte had endured from the moment she realized Dalton was using her trust as a weapon. What began as admiration had twisted into coercion, and the shame of that transformation had nearly silenced her. Yet as Alexis outlined the strategy, something changed in Charlotte's eyes. She realized that staying quiet had not protected Rocco, nor had it protected her. Only the truth could do that now. When the strategy finally crystallized, it became clear that this was not just a legal maneuver, it was a moral shift. For years, Port Charles had danced around its villains, allowing them to manipulate systems and twist vulnerabilities into advantages. But now, two young voices were preparing to alter that pattern. The plan was simple in structure but monumental in impact. Danny and Charlotte would testify that Dalton's evidence was fabricated, his narrative a carefully crafted illusion. Their words would be enough to reverse the prosecution's trajectory and force the authorities to acknowledge the truth they had failed to uncover. Rick stood at the center of this turning point, understanding better than anyone else that justice was not just about evidence, it was about who had the courage to speak it aloud. He saw the danger, the risks, and the political fallout that would ripple across Port Charles once the accusations were made. But he also recognized the rare moment unfolding before him. A chance for two young people to reclaim their integrity, to save a friend, and to challenge a system that had previously dismissed them. Dante and Lulu's fear finally softened. What replaced it was a fierce resolve, a parental instinct aligned with justice instead of fear. They accepted that protecting their children did not mean keeping them silent. It meant standing beside them as they confronted the consequences of someone else's corruption. Jason's silence broke into action as well. He would not allow Dalton to go unchallenged, not when the man had almost destroyed Danny's moral compass and threatened Rocco's future. He stepped into a role he had once tried to abandon, the unwavering protector, not just of his own child but of every person Dalton had endangered. As preparations unfolded, the atmosphere in Port Charles shifted. The fear that had clouded everything began to thin, replaced by a growing realization that Dalton's power was never as solid as it appeared. It had depended entirely on silence, intimidation, and the assumption that no one would dare speak against him. But now, Danny and Charlotte stood ready to dismantle the very foundation of his lies. The legal tables were turning rapidly. For the first time, Dalton's position was unstable, his credibility shattered the moment the teenagers voiced what they had witnessed. The DA's office would be backed into a corner, unable to defend a man who had manipulated minors and falsified official records. Every move Dalton had made now threatened to rebound against him, carrying the weight of criminal prosecution. In the end, the truth became the weapon Dalton never anticipated, one wielded not by adults in power but by the youth he underestimated. Danny and Charlotte were no longer just frightened teenagers caught in the orbit of a dangerous man. They were key witnesses standing at the heart of a case that would redefine their futures and restore Rocco's stolen freedom. Port Charles had seen corrupt officials before, but rarely had the resistance been led by the very children they sought to control. As the final preparations solidified and the teens prepared to step forward, the town itself seemed to hold its breath. Justice was no longer a distant promise, it was a storm gathering strength, ready to break open every deception that had kept Dalton untouchable. And when the storm hit, Dalton would face the one truth he could never manipulate, the courage of the voices he tried to silence.